Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take complex, concentrated analysis and really dissect it until you feel truly informed, giving you that shortcut to expertise.
And today, we're tackling a question that, it really gets to the heart of what makes or breaks a country's reputation.
It absolutely does. We're wrestling with something that hits at the core of international standing and domestic accountability. What happens when a major nation-altering policy just arrives out of the blue as a complete unheralded surprise?
Well, it's so much more than just a logistical hiccup or, a bad day at the office for a diplomat. What we're looking at is a classic textbook diplomatic failure. And it's one that forces a really painful choice.
Okay, so let's set the stage. We have been handed a powerful critique concerning a sudden policy shift. We're talking about the implementation of a U.S. visa bond requirement, and it was applied without any warning to Antigua and Barbuda.
And this is where the paradox comes in, the thing that our source material just keeps coming back to. And it was deeply troubling. It's not like the two countries weren't talking.
Exactly. That's the crucial starting point for our deep dive today. We need to dissect what this failure really implies. Because the source material reveals that senior officials in Antigua and Barbuda claimed they were in, and I'm quoting here, active communication with the U.S. State Department.
Right. Actively talking about visa matters, supposedly. Regular discussions.
And yet, this punitive policy, the visa bond requirement, it still landed with the impact and, frankly, the shock of a complete surprise. It treats a nation that's supposed to be a partner like a geopolitical risk.
And that gap, that's everything. The chasm between active communication and zero foresight. That's the defining variable here. It immediately forces you to ask the question, if they were talking, why on earth were they not warned?
It's more than just a simple oversight.
Oh, it moves way beyond mere bureaucratic oversight. It starts to touch on fundamental questions. Is the country genuinely perceived as a serious, trustworthy partner? Or has it, institutionally, been flagged as some kind of liability?
Because when you are supposedly engaged in serious diplomatic dialogue, you expect, at the very, very least, a heads up, a warning when the policy ground is about to shift so dramatically right under your feet.
A courtesy call. Something.
So our job today is to determine what this failure implies about Antigua and Barbuda's international standing, and, just as importantly, where the internal accountability for this mess actually lies.
And the source material? It's very helpful here. It boils the whole problem down to two devastating interpretations. And this is really the lens through which we need to examine this whole failure.
Okay, what are the two options?
Option one, was this a diplomatic blind spot? An internal failure of competence where critical signals were missed or ignored or maybe just profoundly misinterpreted?
So basically we were asleep at the wheel.
In essence, yes. Or, and this is the much graver possibility, was it a diplomatic blacklist? An intentional, calculated decision by the United States to exclude Antigua and Barbuda from the customary warnings.
Why would they do that?
Because of a profound, fundamental lack of trust in the relationship itself. And the source is clear. Either explanation, blind spot, or blacklist points to a catastrophic failure of diplomacy.
Okay, let's start with the facts then. The technical anatomy of this policy shock. What exactly is this U.S. visa bond requirement? And why does a seemingly administrative rule carry so much diplomatic weight?
Right, so we need to be really specific here. We are talking about a mechanism that the U.S. government uses to manage risk in its visa program. The U.S. visa bond requirement is not just an administrative fee. It's not like paying for a passport photo.
It's a financial instrument.
It's a serious financial instrument. It requires the visa applicant to deposit a pretty significant sum of money. We're often talking thousands of dollars directly with the U.S. government.
And what's the purpose of that deposit? Why hold their money?
It's a guarantee. It serves as monetary collateral. The applicant is essentially posting a bond to ensure that they will comply with the terms of their visit.
And the primary term is?
That you'll leave the U.S. before your permitted stay expires. If you overstay your visa, even by a day, that bond is forfeited. The money is gone.
So it's a tool they use for people they see as a higher risk?
Exactly. It's typically applied to certain individuals or, specific groups that are deemed to present a higher risk of not returning home, what immigration officials call overstay risk.
Okay, so if that's the technical function, and it's usually for individuals, what makes this requirement a major policy shift? Why is it such a significant, almost aggressive diplomatic signal when it's applied to an entire nation? Why isn't this just routine immigration management?
Because the entire implication changes when it shifts from a surgical tool applied to specific high-risk individuals to a blanket policy applied across the board to an entire national population.
It's no longer personal, it's national.
Precisely. It becomes a very loud, very public signal that the sending country, in this case Antigua and Barbuda, is now viewed by the U.S. as a high-risk jurisdiction for non-compliance. It instantly elevates the matter from an individual immigration concern to a severe diplomatic censure.
It's a public slap on the wrist, a vote of no confidence, essentially.
That's a great way to put it. It says to the entire world, we, the United States, do not trust your government. We don't trust your security screening or, frankly, your citizens enough to manage their own return home without us holding their money hostage.
Wow, okay.
And that's why it constitutes a major policy shift, as our source material calls it. Think about the immediate impact. It increases the cost of travel, of tourism, of business, of education for every single citizen of that country overnight.
I can't imagine you're a student accepted to a university or a business person trying to close a deal, and suddenly you have to find, what, $5,000, $10,000 just to tie up in collateral?
Exactly. The economic and the reputational blow is immediate and it is severe. The fact that the shift affects an entire nation is the very reason the failure to anticipate it becomes so critical. This isn't a small change. This is a policy that demands high-level governmental foresight.
And this brings us right back to the core contradiction we have to grapple with, the enormous gap between the formal claims coming from the government and the harsh reality of what happened.
Right. The formal line from Antigua and Barbuda was that senior officials were engaged in active communication with the U.S. State Department on these very visa matters.
Which sounds good on paper. Active communication is what you want.
It is. Active communication is the diplomatic expectation. It suggests regular dialogue, maybe, quarterly meetings, exchanges of reports, deep discussions about security protocols. That's what it should mean.
Yet the reality, the outcome, was this bond policy emerging completely unexpectedly. The source says it arrived out of nowhere.
That phrasing is so telling, isn't it? Out of nowhere. It suggests that whatever communication was happening was either fundamentally lacking in substance or that the officials involved were just profoundly disconnected from the real U.S. policymaking engine.
They were talking, but were they actually communicating?
That disconnect represents a staggering failure of process. I mean, if you are having serious active conversations about managing visa policy, the escalation from standard processing to a blanket national bond requirement, that should only happen after an extended period of very clear warnings.
It should be the last resort.
The absolute last resort. We should be talking about months, if not years, of increasing pressure, of failed negotiations, of documented attempts by the U.S. to mitigate the problem with Antigua and Barbuda's cooperation.
So for it to arrive as a surprise, a total shock, what does that tell you?
It means one of two things happen. Either the A and B negotiators were just talking at a very superficial level, pleasantries, while the U.S. side was signaling profound security concerns that just went right over their heads.
Yeah.
Or the U.S. intentionally chose to cut off communication about this specific change because they had already lost faith in A and B's willingness or ability to act. Either way, it's a disaster.
So let's define the bar here. What does effective, serious diplomatic engagement actually look like in this context? Our source material gives us a pretty clear definition. It says when governments are engaged seriously, they are expected to be briefed, warned, and prepared for policies that affect them nationally.
And that phrase, briefed, warned, and prepared, that's not just jargon. It's the operational definition of respecting a partner nation's sovereignty and its status. It's the bedrock of stable international relations. It ensures there are no surprises that destabilize a government or, punish an entire population unfairly.
Okay, let's break that down then. Let's get into the mechanics. What does it actually mean to be briefed, warned, and prepared? What are the essential procedural steps that should have happened before a nationwide policy change like this was implemented?
We're talking about the established choreography of international relations. It's all built on formality and, crucially, documentation. The first mechanism is the formal diplomatic communique, usually something called a note verbale.
A note verbale. It sounds very formal.
It is. This is a written diplomatic message, often sent from the U.S. Embassy in the country directly to the foreign ministry. It's not a friendly email. It's not a text message. It's a formal, legalistic instrument used to signal escalating concern. It's used to transmit technical data and to set up mandatory consultations. It's a paper trail.
So to use this example, if the U.S. was concerned about, say, a high overstay rate, which is the main driver for a visa bond, they wouldn't just mention it in passing at a cocktail party.
Not if they were serious. They would send a note for bail, providing specific auditable data. It would say, your citizen's overstay rate is currently X%. Our acceptable threshold is Y%. If this trend continues, we will be forced to consider punitive measures. It would outline the problem and project the consequences if the data didn't improve.
It's a formal warning shot.
A very formal one. And this is where the link to complex security and finance matters becomes so critical, especially when we're talking about the context of Caribbean nations.
You're talking about the Citizenship by Investment programs, the CBI.
I am. If the U.S. concern was tied, as it so often is, to a country's citizenship by investment program, where individuals can essentially buy citizenship very rapidly, the note for bail would be even more pointed. It would demand detailed, secure data sharing related to the vetting processes for those CBI applicants.
They want to know who is getting these passports.
They want to ensure they are not security risks, not financial criminals, not sanctioned individuals. They demand to see the due diligence.
Okay, now we're connecting the dots on the specific pressure points. So if the officials from Antigua and Barbuda were focused purely on, say, tourist visa numbers, but they were ignoring or slow-walking these very pointed requests for detailed CBI vetting data,
which Washington views as a massive, gaping security vulnerability,
then they might think they're communicating, while the U.S. sees them as being obstructive or non-compliant on the issue that actually matters most to them.
Exactly. The process is one of graduated escalation. After the formal note verbal, effective diplomacy requires scheduled bilateral consultations. We're talking high-level meetings. The foreign minister should be there, senior security officials. The goal is to negotiate mitigation strategies.
And in that meeting, the U.S. would be explicit.
They would communicate a clear threshold. They would say, if your overstay rates or the gaps in your CBI vetting are not demonstrably reduced by X% in the next quarter, we will be forced to consider remedial measures, including heightened scrutiny or the application of financial bonds. That is being briefed and warned.
And being prepared means Antigua and Barbuda would then use that window, that 6-month or 1-year grace period they were just given to actually fix the problem, to tighten their internal travel protocols, beef up security screenings, or maybe even provide detailed counter data proving their compliance.
Absolutely. The absence of this entire gradual process, the lack of any documented formal warnings, that is the violation of diplomatic norms. To go from what they called active communication to a national bond requirement with zero warning, it fundamentally undermines the entire expectation of a serious, respectful engagement.
It suggests the official channels were either, like you said, profoundly inefficient and only engaged in trivialities,
or that they were intentionally bypassed for much more sinister reasons.
What really stands out to me here is the implication that the communications either just lacked any real policy depth, they were merely ceremonial exchanges, shaking hands for the camera, or that the U.S. State Department ultimately decided that any input from Antigua and Barbuda was simply irrelevant, that their voice just didn't matter in the final policy decision.
And if their voice didn't matter, then the relationship is not one of equal sovereign partners. It's something else. It's more like the relationship between a regulator and a regulated subject.
That's a brutal assessment.
It is. The failure here lies not just in missing the signal, but in fundamentally misinterpreting the very nature of the diplomatic dynamic itself. If the A and B policymakers genuinely believed they were engaged in meaningful policy consultation, that belief was dramatically and very, very publicly proven to be incorrect by the speed and the severity of this sudden action.
Which brings us to the core dilemma presented by the source material. We have these two dramatically different interpretations of what went so wrong, and both of them are, frankly, devastating to the country's standing. Let's dive into hypothesis 1, the failure of internal capacity.
The diplomatic blind spot. This hypothesis suggests an internal failure. The core question here, as the source puts it, is, were the supposed active communications simply shallow and informal? This explanation is all about a failure of competence. It's a self-inflicted wound.
Okay, when the source calls the communications shallow and informal, let's make that concrete. What does that actually look like in the day-to-day life of a diplomat? The original script was a bit vague on this, so let's give some real examples.
Sure. Informality means you're relying heavily on personal relationships and low-level transactional exchanges instead of robust institutional systems. It might look like an official from A&B using WhatsApp or making personal phone calls to a mid-level U.S. desk officer.
Someone they know from a conference.
Exactly. They're discussing procedural minutia, maybe trying to expedite one person's visa, maybe even arranging a lunch. Technically, they're fulfilling the definition of active communication, but they are not using the formal documented channels necessary for serious policy discussion.
Like the note for bail you mentioned.
Right. They're avoiding the very channels that create a record and signal seriousness. They're mistaking social courtesy for a policy commitment. They're talking to the wrong people, or about the wrong things, or in the wrong way.
And you said documentation is key.
It's everything. Crucially, they're often missing the required policy-setting data. A serious diplomatic effort requires dedicating senior staff, analysts who can read the data, interpret subtle signals, and understand Washington's security posture. If you're just having a friendly chat, you're not exchanging threat assessments.
Okay, let's link this directly back to the U.S. security concerns we talked about, particularly those citizenship by investment programs. Why would the officials' failure to prioritize those specific data requests lead directly to this national bond requirement?
Because from the U.S. perspective, the CBI programs in the Caribbean are a significant security vulnerability. It's a known issue. They see it as a potential fast track to a powerful passport.
And if an individual with a problematic background gets one of those passports,
Someone involved in transnational crime, money laundering, maybe even terror financing, if they can acquire that citizenship, they might gain visa-free access to many countries. And it significantly complicates U.S. security screening efforts. It creates a backdoor.
So let's play this out. The U.S. State Department repeatedly sends formal or even informal requests to Antigua and Barbuda for more comprehensive, real-time data on their CBI applicants. They want to see information sharing agreement. They want to know the due diligence procedures, the source of wealth verification.
All very standard high-level security requests.
But the A&B officials on the other end treat those urgent requests as just routine bureaucratic paperwork. Maybe they're understaffed, maybe they don't see the urgency.
Then they've created their own blind spot. They're receiving massive red flags written in the formal language of diplomacy, but their lack of institutional capacity or training prevents them from recognizing that these small, specific data requests are escalating rapidly toward a national crisis.
The U.S. stopped seeing their CBI program as a legitimate economic development tool.
And starts seeing Antigua and Barbuda as a weak link in the global security chain, a potential vulnerability that needs to be managed, not a partner to be consulted.
It's the difference between hearing a casual complaint from a neighbor and recognizing that they're about to build a giant wall between your houses.
That's a perfect analogy. If the officials lack the training to recognize the bureaucratic language of escalating security concern, the failure is purely internal. It's on them.
And that leads to profound internal failings, as the source calls it.
It does. If the communications were shallow, it points toward an inability to properly assess external risk and engage seriously in high-stakes negotiations. They completely failed to recognize that if they couldn't or wouldn't provide the necessary security guarantees about the CBI program, the U.S. would eventually just implement a blunt unilateral instrument like the visa bond to mitigate the risk themselves.
So the blind spot hypothesis means A&B was fundamentally undermined by its own professional inadequacy.
That's the argument. It makes this an extremely costly mistake, one born of poor staffing, maybe a lack of intellectual bandwidth, or incorrect priorities. But it's potentially free of any malicious external intent from the U.S.
They weren't being targeted, they were just being incompetent.
According to this hypothesis, yes. The responsibility for the catastrophic result lands squarely on the internal leadership for failing to deploy the necessary talent and rigor. They might have been talking constantly, but nobody in the conversation on their side was correctly interpreting the severe risk signals related to financial integrity and security screening.
Okay, now we have to shift to the far more devastating possibility. Hypothesis 2, the diplomatic blacklist. This suggests A&B was, and I'm quoting again, simply not trusted enough to be brought into the loop. This moves the failure from internal mismanagement to external deliberate exclusion.
And this is the much, much graver charge. Because if the U.S. made the intentional decision to bypass the typical warnings, it signals a complete rupture of diplomatic faith. It's not that the A&B officials weren't listening. It's that the U.S. decided preemptively that warning them would actually be counterproductive.
Counterproductive how? Let's explore why the U.S. State Department would actively choose to bypass the norms and exclude a partner nation. What circumstances, beyond just general disapproval, would lead to this level of intentional diplomatic isolation?
Well, intentional exclusion suggests that the U.S. believes that Antigua and Barbuda, if they were warned, might actively work against U.S. interests. This is what happens when a major power suspects that the partner nation is either compromised by third parties,
Like who?
perhaps foreign intelligence services from rival nations, or powerful transnational criminal organizations that have influence inside the government. Or they might just believe the partner is fundamentally unwilling to cooperate fully on sensitive security matters.
So instead of being seen as just a passive, incompetent partner, which is the blind spot theory, A and B is now seen as an unreliable, potentially active security risk. That's the blacklist.
Exactly. The calculation from the U.S. side might be, if we warn A and B that we're about to implement this bond
That
requirement.
might tip someone off.
Precisely. That A and B officials might immediately leak the information, allowing high-risk individuals, maybe people associated with the CBI program or other sensitive areas, to accelerate their travel plans or move assets out of reach before the policy locks them down. A fundamental lack of trust completely eliminates the space for shared problem solving.
So if the U.S. has intelligence, or even just a strong suspicion, that A and B is not adequately controlling its borders, its financial institutions, or the integrity of its passport system, they might conclude that issuing a warning would only compromise the policy's effectiveness.
It becomes an instrument of enforcement, not negotiation. The surprise is the policy. The element of shock is a feature, not a bug.
And the immediate global implication of that status is severe.
Oh, it's terrible. This blacklist status would severely impact the country's international standing, as the source notes. When a major global power like the U.S. treats a nation this way, other major global actors take immediate note. We're talking about key financial hubs in Canada, the EU, the UK.
They see the smoke and assume there's a fire.
They interpret it as a credible signal that Antigua and Barbuda does not adhere to international security and financial standards. They start asking their own questions.
So the failure here wasn't just diplomatic, it was a fundamental failure to maintain the necessary security and financial integrity standards that are required for serious international engagement. The blacklist isn't just about visas, it's a red flag to the entire global financial system.
It is a profound reputational stain. Other nations may start increasing their own scrutiny. They could impose new trade barriers or raise the regulatory risk premium associated with doing business in or with Antigua and Barbuda.
It's a domino effect.
It is. And the damage to long-term credibility, which is something you earn over decades, far outweighs the immediate financial burden of the visa bond. The shocking arrival of the policy in this hypothesis is not an accident. It is an intended feature of the diplomatic punishment, designed to deliver the maximum systemic shock and send a message.
Okay, so regardless of which hypothesis is true, the internal blind spot or the external blacklist, the source material concludes with this inescapable fact. Either explanation points to a troubling failure.
And that shared conclusion is so vital because it guarantees accountability, regardless of whether the error originated internally from incompetence or was triggered externally by loss of trust. The catastrophic result for the country is exactly the same. A total failure to anticipate a nation-affecting risk.
The degrees of failure are crucial, though, aren't they? Because they mandate completely different fixes.
Completely different. If it was the blind spot, the failure is managerial. The problem's internal. So you fix the staff, you improve the training, you establish formal protocols. The analogy here might be, we just need to buy a new pair of glasses to improve our internal vision.
But if it was the blacklist?
If it was the blacklist, the failure is systemic and reputational. The fix is so much deeper. It would require a massive political and institutional overhaul. The government has to prove to the world that it has severed any ties with whatever compromised it, that it has fundamentally tightened its security framework, and then it has to embark on a long, painful effort to rebuild global trust.
In that case, the analogy isn't new glasses.
No. In this case, the analogy is more like needing a complete institutional personality transplant. It's a much more serious condition.
What's so universally troubling is that both explanations reflect so poorly on A and B's diplomacy. I mean, serious diplomatic players, nations that are viewed as reliable partners, they simply do not get surprised by policies that impact their entire economy and population. It just doesn't happen.
The surprise factor, as we noted, it eliminates any possibility of mitigation. You can't lobby against a policy that is already in force. You can't proactively manage the public narrative. You can't prepare your private sector for the shock.
They're always on the back foot. Always. The shock itself guarantees the maximum negative impact, and it confirms to the rest of the world that Antigua and Barbuda was either, sleeping at the wheel or was being intentionally ignored. That lack of foresight is the central failure of leadership.
So as we shift our focus inward, the source material really zeroes in on the structural issues and the internal political consequences of this failure. And this section provides a fascinating, if pretty concerning, look at how the government actually handled the negotiations leading up to this crisis.
And this specific detail provided in the source is perhaps the most concrete piece of evidence we have of internal mismanagement. According to the Prime Minister, Gaston Brown, his own Foreign Affairs Minister, Chet Green, was not involved in these critical visa negotiations with the U.S. State Department.
Wait, let me just repeat that to make sure I heard it right. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, the government's chief diplomat, the designated point person for all bilateral relations, was excluded from discussions with the U.S. State Department on a core foreign affairs matter like visa requirements.
That's not just a red flag. That's an organizational catastrophe.
It immediately suggests a profound fragmentation and incoherence in the diplomatic process. For any nation, but especially a small one that's reliant on external trade and tourism, the management of bilateral relations with a major power like the U.S. has to be centralized through the foreign ministry.
Why is that so important?
Because the ministry possesses the institutional memory. It has the trained staff, the career diplomats, and the formal authority necessary to conduct these kinds of high-stakes negotiations. They're the professionals.
So, if the foreign minister is excluded, who on earth was conducting these negotiations, and why would you ever do that?
Well, the source implies the negotiations were likely being handled by the Prime Minister's office directly, perhaps through a special envoy or a political appointee, maybe even the PM's chief of staff.
And why would a leader do that? Why bypass your own expert?
It often happens for political motives. The centralization of power is a big one. Or it could be because the discussions touch on particularly sensitive areas, like the CBI program, that the Prime Minister wants to maintain direct personal control over, bypassing the traditional bureaucratic oversight and, the paper trail that a ministry creates.
Okay, but if the talks were being run by someone without the official foreign affairs portfolio, what kind of diplomatic confusion does that create on the U.S. side?
It creates immediate questions of authority and relevance. A U.S. desk officer at the State Department who's dealing with a non-portfolio official, like a chief of staff, might view the entire exercise as informational, not authoritative.
They're not talking to the real decision maker, institutionally speaking.
Right. The U.S. State Department relies on talking to the proper authorities to ensure there's institutional buy-in and follow-through. If they were communicating with someone who lacked the institutional clout or the portfolio breadth of the foreign minister, the U.S. might have concluded that A&B wasn't taking the matter seriously enough to dispatch its chief diplomat.
And it gets worse, because if the officials who were conducting the talks were political appointees rather than career diplomats, they would almost certainly lack the necessary training to recognize those subtle warnings we've been talking about.
Absolutely. This detail strongly reinforces the blind spot hypothesis.
Oh, so?
Because the career diplomats within the Foreign Affairs Ministry are trained over decades to spot those subtle escalating warnings. A change in tone in a memo, the use of specific legalistic language, those increasingly insistent data requests. They understand the graduated escalation model because they live it every day.
But if the talks are shunted off to an ad hoc committee or a personal liaison of the Prime Minister,
all of that critical institutional knowledge and expertise is just lost. It's thrown out the window. The fragmentation of authority made the blind spot not just possible, but highly, highly likely.
And what about the domestic side? The exclusion of the minister means that the standard government mechanisms for preparing for a national crisis were deliberately bypassed.
Which means when the policy finally hit, the Foreign Affairs Minister was probably just as blindsided as the general public. That makes a coordinated, informed government response virtually impossible.
It must completely undermine internal trust within the cabinet.
Of course, how can the government present a unified front to the world when the head of its own diplomatic corps was deliberately excluded from what was arguably the most critical bilateral discussion they were having? It just amplifies the appearance of diplomatic incoherence and feeds the domestic crisis of confidence.
So this brings us back to what the source material identifies as the core of the crisis. It says this issue goes right to the heart of credibility, competence, and our country's international standing. Let's return to that necessary distinction between competence and credibility, because it seems the failure of one invariably compromises the other.
It does. Competence is the functional capacity. It's the ability to successfully execute the diplomatic job, which includes anticipation, negotiation, and monitoring. The surprise arrival of this visa bond requirement is just undeniable objective proof of a failure of competence. The machine did not work as intended.
And credibility is different. Credibility, conversely, is the reputation. It's the perception of truthfulness and reliability, both internationally and at home.
And the crisis arises because the failure of competence instantly damages credibility. It's an immediate consequence. When senior officials publicly claim they were in active communication, but somehow failed to anticipate the biggest policy shift in recent memory, that claim itself becomes suspect.
People start asking, well, was the communication really active?
Or was that claim merely an attempt to deflect political fallout and minimize the appearance of failure after the fact? It puts the government in a terrible position.
It forces them into a purely reactive posture. They have to spend all their time and energy explaining why they failed, explaining why they missed the warning, or explaining why they were excluded, instead of proactively addressing the underlying issues that led to the policy in the first place.
Be they the CBI vetting issues, the overstay rates, or their own institutional weakness. All that energy is wasted on damage control.
And that's incredibly costly. The reactive defense erodes trust globally and internally. I mean, the primary audience for the source critique we're dissecting is the Antiguan and Barbudan public. They're the ones demanding to know how their leaders allowed such a nationally detrimental policy to materialize without a single warning.
They are the ones paying the price, literally in the form of these visa bonds and reputationally.
And the source material really encapsulates this political expectation with a very clear demand. It calls for leadership that anticipates risks instead of explaining them after the fact. That focus on foresight is the ultimate mandate for any government.
Anticipation is always superior to reaction. Proactive diplomacy identifies potential threats, it addresses them privately and bilaterally, and it mitigates them before they become public punitive requirements.
Can you give an example of what that would have looked like?
Sure. A competent diplomatic corps, recognizing the growing global concern about CBI programs in general, would have proactively tightened their own regulations years ago. They would have improved their data sharing, and then they would have gone to Washington and informed them that they had already fixed the problem, thus preempting the need for a visa bond in the first place.
They would have gotten ahead of it.
Exactly. But if the government is constantly in the position of explaining why they were surprised, explaining the blacklist, explaining the BlindSpot, they are demonstrably failing that core mandate of foresight.
And that lack of foresight, it doesn't just impact the politicians, it impacts the national identity.
It costs the entire nation. Through increased visa costs for families and students, through a damaged business reputation, and through a diminished international standing. And anticipating risk, it requires the political courage to address uncomfortable internal truths.
Like the structural problems that were exposed by excluding the foreign affairs minister from his own job.
Precisely. The ability to spot the risk before the disaster hits is the true measure of a robust, competent, and credible diplomatic service.
So after this whole deep dive, what does this all mean?
Well, to synthesize our findings, this deep dive into the sudden U.S. visa bond requirement applied to Antigua and Barbuda, it really exposes a profound and multifaceted diplomatic failure. The government was left completely scrambling, forcing the public and us to choose between accepting a failure of internal competence, the blind spot,
Which was exemplified by that structural fragmentation in leadership and the failure to prioritize those CBI security concerns.
or a failure of external trust, the blacklist, which suggests the U.S. had deemed the nation too unreliable to even be warned.
And the unifying element in both of those terrible options is the total failure to be briefed, warned, and prepared. This situation is just a powerful lesson that in high-stakes diplomacy, communication alone is not enough. It has to be serious, it has to be institutional, and it must be structured to yield foresight.
A sudden surprise of this magnitude guarantees the maximum possible damage to a country's reputation and its economic future.
And the crisis of credibility we discussed is just amplified by the structural issues we identified, namely that baffling exclusion of the foreign affairs minister from the talks, which all but confirms that a proper institutional diplomatic risk assessment just wasn't being conducted.
So the nation is now tasked with demanding accountability and trying to determine whether it suffered a simple, though costly, managerial failure or a much more profound breakdown of its global reputation.
It's a really powerful lesson in the necessity of reading between the diplomatic lines. The source material ends by demanding accountability, asking what's at stake. And if we take the government's premise that active communication was in fact true, we're left with a deeper, more provocative question for you, the learner, to explore.
Right. If the discussions were genuinely active, then the failure wasn't in the absence of communication, but in the failure to correctly interpret a critical signal. So the question becomes, what specific, nuanced piece of information was missed?
What was the signal that went right over their heads?
Exactly. Was it a seemingly innocuous request for a very specific set of CBI vetting files? Was it a scheduling conflict that subtly suggested the U.S. was pulling back? Or maybe a subtle change in the rank of the U.S. officials who were attending the meetings, sending a junior officer instead of a senior one? What signal must have been present in those communications that the leadership failed to recognize as a critical nation-affecting risk?
So the catastrophic failure might not have been a missing memo at all, but a missed interpretation of tone, of weight, and of priority.
And the true cost of that kind of diplomatic fragmentation is often paid in the failure to understand the subtle language of escalation, which requires not just reading the words on the page, but understanding the geopolitical weight behind them.
And that subtle difference costs a nation dearly. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
See you next time.